He hid his garage from his family his entire life. No one knew what was inside until his nephew received the key after his death. The secret revealed inside shocked everyone to tears. Subscribe and write in the comments. Would you risk opening a garage like this? The house on the quiet suburban street still seemed to echo with laughter, though it had long since fallen silent. To the neighbors who often passed by, it was a warm and inviting place where joy once seemed to overflow from every corner. And at the heart of that joy had been Samuel Harris, a man full of life, love, and promise. In those days before tragedy marked his world forever, he was a husband whose devotion could be felt in every glance at his wife, and a father whose pride shone with each step of his daughter's growth. To know Samuel was to see a man whose life appeared blessed, complete, and almost untouchable by misfortune. Samuel was not a man born into wealth, yet his skill with machines made him exceptional. From his youth, he had a gift for understanding the pulse of engines, the heartbeat of automobiles. While his peers struggled with ordinary repairs, Samuel seemed to breathe life into cold metal. Friends would often say his hands were guided not just by knowledge, but by instinct, as though steel and rubber themselves whispered their secrets to him. By the time he had built a life of his own, Samuel had earned a reputation as a mechanic and engineer whose precision was unmatched. But beyond his talent, it was his family that defined him. His wife Naomi was a woman of quiet grace, whose gentle presence softened every sharp edge of his character. She had a smile that calmed storms and a patience that soothed his restless energy. And their daughter, little Claire, was the light of both their lives. At 7 years old, she was a bundle of laughter and curiosity, endlessly asking questions, endlessly running through the house with her braids flying behind her. For Samuel, every evening spent tinkering in his garage became an opportunity to show Claire how a carburetor worked, how a wheel aligned, how the heart of a car mirrored the heart of a person. He would look at her wide-eyed wonder and see a future where she might grow into the world he cherished, curious, confident, unafraid. What bound the family together in those days was not merely love, but shared dreams. Samuel had recently bought a car he had long desired, a rare sports model that gleamed like liquid silver under the sun. To the neighborhood, it was a marvel, a vehicle that drew eyes every time it purred down the road. But for Samuel, it was not simply a machine. It was the symbol of his hard work, his triumphs, and the life he wanted to share with his wife and daughter. Naomi would tease him about polishing the car more often than he polished his shoes, yet she could see the joy it gave him. Claire would climb into the passenger seat with squeals of delight, pretending she was steering the wheel, laughing whenever her father made the car hum. Those Sunday drives became the rhythm of their happiness. Sometimes they would drive to the countryside, where fields stretched endlessly under skies that seemed too wide for one's heart to contain. Other times they would visit lakes, where Claire would chase ducks along the shore, while Samuel and Naomi held hands. They were simple moments, but they stitched together a tapestry of family life that felt unbreakable. To anyone who saw them, they were the embodiment of warmth and promise, a family for whom tragedy seemed impossible. The morning of that fateful day had dawned with the same brightness as so many before. Samuel had planned a short trip out of town, nothing extraordinary, just a ride to the hills where the air was fresh and the views wide. He had promised Claire they would stop for ice cream on the way back. Naomi had packed a small basket with fruit and water, though she knew it was unnecessary. It was her way of ensuring every journey felt like a little picnic, a little memory waiting to be made. The silver car gleamed as Samuel backed it out of the driveway. Claire, buckled in the back seat, sang along to a song on the radio, her voice pure and full of innocence. Naomi, seated beside her husband, reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, her eyes crinkling with that smile that had comforted him through every struggle. Samuel felt his chest swell with gratitude, a silent prayer passing through him that such moments would last forever. The road stretched ahead, framed by trees whose leaves shimmered in the sunlight. The car's engine purred with effortless power, a sound that Samuel loved as deeply as a musician loves the resonance of his instrument. They spoke of trivial things, Claire's drawings, Naomi's garden, Samuel's plans for the garage. And all the while, laughter filled the cabin, drowning out the weight of the world beyond those windows. But happiness, fragile as glass, can shatter in a breath. It happened so suddenly that Samuel would replay it in his mind for years, unable to find the single moment where fate had tipped the scales. One second, there was music, laughter, the scent of Naomi's hair in the breeze. The next, a sharp cry from the back seat, a flash of steel on the road, the looming presence of a truck swerving where it should not have been. Samuel's hands clenched the wheel, his foot slammed the brake. The world convulsed into screeching tires and tearing metal. The sound was unbearable, a violent symphony of destruction. Glass shattered, the seatbelts tore against their bodies, and Samuel's head struck hard against the wheel. He tasted blood before he even knew what had happened. The car spun, twisted, and slammed into the guardrail. Then silence. When Samuel opened his eyes, the world was blurred, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke and oil. His ears rang. Pain surged through him, but not enough to mask the horror that rushed in as he turned his head. Naomi was slumped, her face pale, blood trickling from her temple. Claire's small form was motionless in the back seat, her toy still clutched in her hand. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking into the silence. He tried to move, reaching out with trembling hands. He shook Naomi's arm, called her name, begged her to open her eyes. He turned toward Claire, his body screaming with pain as he stretched to touch her. Nothing. No response. The stillness was more violent than any sound. Tears blurred his vision. He screamed into the emptiness, a raw animal sound, as though his heart itself had been torn from his chest. He pounded the dashboard, the seat, the ruined metal around him, desperate for this to be anything but real. How could the world take them and leave him? How could he still draw breath when their lungs no longer did? The minutes that followed were a blur of sirens and voices, but Samuel scarcely heard them. Paramedics pulled him from the wreckage, their hands steady, their words firm, but to Samuel they were nothing but shadows moving in a nightmare. He screamed at them to help his wife, his daughter, but he saw the stillness in their gestures, the pity in their eyes. He knew. Deep inside, he already knew. On that day, the man who had lived for his family died alongside them. The body of Samuel Harris survived, broken but alive. Yet the soul of the man husband, father, dreamer, was left behind in the twisted wreckage of a silver car on a country road. From that moment on, everything changed. The hospital bed where Samuel awoke in the days after the accident seemed more like a coffin than a place of recovery. The white walls were suffocating in their stillness, the fluorescent lights above merciless in their brightness. He lay there patched and stitched, his ribs bound, his head wrapped in gauze, his body reminding him with every shallow breath that he had survived. But when his eyes turned to the empty space around him, when the reality of what was no longer there settled into his chest, survival felt like the cruelest punishment fate could deliver. There were flowers on the nightstand. Someone from the neighborhood must have sent them. Their bright petals were vulgar to him, a mocking reminder of life continuing in color when his world had gone black. Nurses checked on him, their voices too gentle, too kind, as if they feared one wrong word would push him off the edge. Doctors told him he was lucky, that few men walked away from such a wreck. Lucky. He wanted to laugh in their faces, to tell them that luck was what had died in that car with Naomi and Claire. When the day of the funerals came, Samuel moved like an automaton. Dressed in a black suit that felt foreign against his skin, he followed the caskets as though in a dream. Naomi's coffin was polished, a simple beauty befitting her quiet grace. Claire's was smaller, unbearably small, adorned with white lilies that seemed too pure for the earth to hold. He did not speak at the service. He could not. Words were meaningless. He stood stiff, his eyes dry, not because there were no tears, but because he had cried them all in the wreckage, screamed them all into the void. When the coffins were lowered, he felt his knees buckle, though he forced himself to remain upright. To collapse would have been an admission of weakness, but inside he had already fallen, further than anyone could see. In the weeks that followed, he withdrew from everything that had once defined him. The garage that had been his temple of creativity became his prison. The neighbors would sometimes see him standing there long after midnight, the light glowing faintly through the cracks of the door, but he allowed no one near. When a well-meaning friend offered to help him clean or repair something, Samuel's eyes burned with such intensity that they quickly retreated. He began to issue sharp warnings whenever the subject arose. No one was to step inside that garage. It was his sanctuary, his graveyard, his punishment. At first, people assumed he was drowning his grief in mechanical work, a man returning to the only thing that made sense. But it soon became clear there was something darker at play. Samuel no longer joined neighbors for coffee, no longer greeted the children who used to run to him to watch him repair bicycles and small engines. He stopped answering the phone, stopped opening the door, stopped acknowledging the world that carried on without his family. To the eyes of others, he had become a shadow, a hollow man still walking, yet long gone. Inside the garage, his life narrowed to a single obsession. There, amid the smell of oil and rust, stood what remained of the car, the twisted, mangled machine that had stolen his family and left him breathing. Most would have sent it to the scrapyard, eager to erase the memory of it. But Samuel could not let it go. To abandon it would have been to abandon the last piece of them, to deny the horror that defined him now. So he began, with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, to rebuild it. Every night he returned to the wreck, touching the cold frame as though he were touching their ghosts. The work was agony. Each dent hammered out was a memory relived. Naomi's laugh beside him, Claire's tiny voice singing in the back seat. Each bolt tightened was a wound reopened, a reminder that his hands could fix steel, but never bring back flesh. He wept over the engine, over the dashboard, over the shattered glass. He swept away grain by grain. Yet he continued, because the pain was the only thread that tied him to them. Time blurred. Days became nights. Nights became months. His body weakened from neglect, but his mind clung stubbornly to the work. The house around him fell into disrepair, dust gathering, dishes unwashed, mail unopened. But the garage remained immaculate, every tool in place, every piece of the car cared for, with fanatical devotion. It was here that he lived, if living could still be said of him. The townspeople whispered. Children dared each other to run past his driveway, laughing nervously about the haunted garage no one could enter. Adults spoke in softer tones, shaking their heads at the man who had once been full of warmth, now turned inward, unreachable. Some pitied him, others avoided him altogether, but all knew the rule. Samuel's garage was forbidden ground. Alone, he began to keep journals, scribbled late at night when his hands trembled too much to work. The pages became confessions, letters to the wife and daughter he would never see again. He wrote of his guilt, of his hatred for himself, of his conviction that he should have died in their place. He wrote of the car as though it were alive, a monster he both loathed and adored. You took them from me, he scrawled once, and so I will take you apart, piece by piece, until you return them to me. The notebooks filled with his anguish, his obsession, his futile attempt to hold on to the fragments of a shattered life. Years slipped past, each one dragging him deeper into solitude. His hair grayed, his back bent, his hands grew gnarled with age, yet still he toiled. The car, once a broken husk, began to resemble its former beauty again, though only Samuel saw it. To the world outside, he was a ghost, a rumor, a man swallowed by his own grief. Yet in his heart, he carried a secret vow. He would not let anyone else touch the car. It was his burden, his penance, and his only connection to Naomi and Claire. To share it would be to cheapen it, to let others gaze upon a wound that belonged only to him. So he guarded it fiercely, snapping at anyone who came too close, ensuring the garage remained a locked vault of pain. By the time he reached his final years, the line between life and death blurred for him. He no longer sought companionship, no longer cared for his body or his future. His existence was reduced to two things, the car and the memory of the family he had lost. To those who passed his house, he seemed already gone, a withered figure consumed by shadows. Yet within the garage, under the dim light of a single bulb, Samuel continued his endless ritual of restoration, keeping alive not just a machine, but the echo of a happiness long since destroyed. And though he spoke little, the few words he did utter to anyone who dared ask about the garage remained the same, delivered with a gravity that silenced even the boldest. Do not touch it. Do not open it. Never. Thus the years closed around him, a man alive in body but dead in spirit, clinging to the wreckage of his past as though it were the only thing tethering him to the world. The house grew old, the man grew older, and the garage door remained shut, holding inside it not just metal and glass, but the remnants of a soul that could not let go. The years slipped away with the same steady rhythm as the pendulum of a forgotten clock, and Samuel aged within the shadow of his grief, a man whose soul had stopped moving forward long before his body finally surrendered. By the time death came for him, it was not dramatic nor violent, but a quiet drifting away, as though the world itself had grown tired of waiting for him to rejoin the living. One morning he was found slumped in his chair, his head bowed slightly, a photograph of Naomi and Claire resting on the armrest beside his weakened hand. His eyes were closed, his breathing had stopped, and the house that had known silence for decades grew heavier still with the weight of absence. The news of his passing reached the neighborhood with little surprise, for most had already spoken of him as though he were gone. Whispers spread quickly among those who had once tried to help, among the children who had grown up with the stories of the forbidden garage, and among relatives who had drifted far away, unable to understand the man Samuel had become. Yet even in death he was cloaked in mystery, and it seemed fitting that the house he left behind bore not comfort, but questions. The funeral drew a modest gathering. Some came out of duty, others from curiosity, but among them was one who carried the weight of a deeper connection, his nephew Marcus. Marcus had admired Samuel in his youth, not for his silence in later years, but for the memories that reached back to a time before the tragedy. He remembered a man who once let him sit on his lap to hold a wrench, who explained how engines breathed like living creatures, who carried a spark in his eyes whenever he spoke of machines. Marcus was a child then, but he had felt the warmth of his uncle's attention in a way that lingered long after Samuel withdrew from the world. To him, Samuel was not just the ghost everyone else knew, but the echo of a man who had once lived with passion. At the cemetery, Marcus watched as the coffin descended into the earth, the sound of soil hitting the wood dull and final. Around him, relatives murmured, some shaking their heads at the lonely figure Samuel had become, others pitying the years he had wasted in solitude. Marcus listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the fresh mound of earth, feeling both sorrow and an inexplicable pull, as though this death was not truly an ending, but a summons. It was later that day, when the mourners had departed and the family gathered at his mother's house to share a meal and remember the man they had buried, that the unexpected occurred. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window they saw a black sedan stop in front of the house, its engine humming softly before falling silent. A woman stepped out, dressed in a professional suit, her expression composed yet touched with the gravity of her purpose. She introduced herself as Samuel's lawyer, and the room filled with surprise. Few had imagined that Samuel, who spoke to so few and seemed to shun the world, would have kept counsel with anyone, much less entrusted someone with his affairs. The family gathered around, curiosity sharpening their grief, as the woman, her name was Ms. Karina, set her leather briefcase on the table and withdrew a sealed envelope. Her voice was calm, though it carried the weight of finality as she explained that Samuel had left specific instructions for the handling of his estate. The estate itself was meager, for Samuel had lived a life stripped of indulgence. The house was worn, the furniture old, the accounts modest. Yet it was not the distribution of property that caught their breath, but the letter, addressed to one man alone, Marcus. Hands trembling, Marcus accepted the envelope. Its paper was thick, the seal pressed firmly into wax, as though Samuel had wanted to ensure no one else could break it. With the family watching, he hesitated only a moment before sliding his finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet, the handwriting unmistakably Samuel's firm, deliberate strokes that bore the imprint of a man who once poured his soul into blueprints and journals. Marcus read aloud, his voice unsteady as he carried the words of the dead into the air. Samuel's message was not long, but it was heavy with the weight of years unsaid. He spoke of love for Marcus, of regret for the distance that had grown between them, of sorrow for the misunderstandings that had clouded his later life. But more than anything, he spoke of the burden he carried, the secret he had guarded, and the wish that Marcus would be the one to inherit not just his possessions, but his truth. "I leave to you the key," the letter read. "In the garage lies my life, my sorrow, and the reason I could never let go. No one else must open it. It is yours now. Do with it what you will, but know that within those walls is the truth I could never speak." When Marcus lowered the letter, silence fell heavy upon the room. The relatives exchanged uneasy glances, their minds circling the legend of the forbidden garage, the decades of secrecy, the countless warnings Samuel had issued. The words "my sorrow" hung in the air like a cloud, stirring both fear and curiosity. Yet for Marcus, there was no question. His heart beat with the certainty that this was meant for him alone, that his uncle's shadowed legacy had found its way into his hands. From her briefcase, Ms. Karina produced a small box, its surface worn with age. She handed it to Marcus, who opened it slowly, his fingers brushing against cold metal. Inside lay an old-fashioned key, large and heavy, its teeth carved with precision. It was out of place in the modern world, a relic of another time, and yet it seemed to pulse with meaning. Marcus held it up, the room reflecting in its dull gleam, and felt the weight of responsibility press into his palm. The family's voices rose, questions tumbling one over the other. What could be in the garage? Why had Samuel been so secretive? Was it something valuable, dangerous, or shameful? But Marcus barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the key, his thoughts on the man who had raised walls of silence, but had chosen, in the end, to pass them down to him. That night, long after the relatives had gone and the house had grown quiet, Marcus lay awake, the letter and the key resting on the nightstand beside him. He turned the words over in his mind again and again, the image of his uncle bent over his work in the garage, filling his thoughts. The secrecy that had once seemed like madness now felt like a burden entrusted, a final plea from a man who had carried too much for too long. Sleep would not come. The shadows in the room seemed alive, whispering with the echo of his uncle's silence. By dawn, Marcus knew what he had to do. He would go to the house, he would open the garage, and he would uncover the truth that had consumed Samuel's life. Whether it brought pain or peace, it was no longer his uncle's burden. It was his. And so, as the first light of morning stretched across the sky, Marcus rose with the key in his hand, his heart pounding with both fear and determination. The legacy of pain had been passed, and now it was his turn to face what lay behind that locked door. The morning Marcus set foot on his late uncle's property, the air seemed unnaturally still, as though the entire street were holding its breath. The house stood exactly as he remembered it from childhood visits, unchanged in its weary bones, a structure that had withstood decades of silence and grief. The paint had faded to a dull shade, the windows bore the cloudiness of neglect, and the lawn had grown wild, its untrimmed grass bending under the weight of dew. Yet it was not the house that drew his eyes, nor the memories that surfaced of a warmer time before tragedy. It was the garage, squat and unyielding at the side of the house, its door closed as it had been for more than 20 years. To Marcus, it seemed less like an ordinary structure and more like a sentinel, guarding the hidden truth of a man's ruined soul. The key felt heavy in his palm as he approached. His heart beat too fast, echoing in his chest with the same rhythm it had when he had first read his uncle's letter. Each step carried him closer to the place that had been the center of whispered conversations in the family, the place from which light sometimes leaked at night, the place Samuel had turned into both his sanctuary and his prison. The silence of the neighborhood pressed in on him, broken only by the sound of his shoes brushing against gravel. He paused before the garage door. His hand trembled as he lifted the key, its cold surface biting into his skin. For a moment he hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of the years that had preceded this instant. It felt almost sacrilegious to intrude, as though by opening the door he might violate the sanctity of his uncle's grief. And yet he reminded himself, Samuel had chosen him, entrusted him, pleaded with him in death to bear this truth. The lock clicked, a sound both ordinary and monumental, and with a deep breath, Marcus pulled the door upward. The hinges groaned as though protesting, the wood and metal complaining after years of immobility. A draft of stale air greeted him, tinged with the unmistakable scent of oil, dust, and metal. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, Marcus took his first step inside. The garage was not cluttered as he had imagined, not the chaotic space of a man driven to obsession. Instead, it bore the mark of meticulous care, of hands that had arranged and rearranged with relentless discipline. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes neatly stacked and labeled in Samuel's precise handwriting. Tools gleamed in their places, polished despite their years of use, each resting exactly where it belonged. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary, nothing that explained decades of secrecy. Marcus moved deeper into the room, his footsteps echoing faintly. He lifted the lid of a box and found photographs carefully bundled together, their black and white tones capturing a younger Samuel in moments of happiness that Marcus had only glimpsed in his imagination. There were images of Samuel and Naomi laughing beside cars at exhibitions, of Claire as a toddler perched on her father's shoulders, her tiny hands clutching his hair. The sight of them tore at Marcus's heart, for they were evidence of a life so vivid, so full of love, that its absence now felt unbearable. Beside the photographs lay journals, the same careful handwriting filling page after page. Marcus skimmed a few entries, his throat tightening as he realized these were not mere records of mechanical work. They were confessions, fragments of thoughts written in the stillness of nights too heavy to bear. Samuel had poured into them his guilt, his despair, in his determination to make sense of the wreckage that had defined his existence. Marcus set the journals back down, unwilling to devour them too quickly, sensing that the deeper truth lay beyond. At the far end of the garage, his eyes caught sight of a thick curtain drawn across a section of the space. It was opaque, a barrier that seemed deliberate, the final veil Samuel had left behind. Marcus's breath quickened as he walked toward it, each step echoing louder in his ears than the last. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the coarse fabric, and paused again. This was the heart of the secret. Whatever lay behind the curtain was the reason Samuel had kept the world at bay. With a sudden pull, Marcus swept it aside. The breath caught in his chest, his knees nearly buckling at the sight before him. There, under the dim light that flickered from a single bulb above, stood a car. But it was no ordinary vehicle, no relic rusting in obscurity. It gleamed, immaculate, as though it had never known the violence of the world outside. Its polished body reflected the faint light, unblemished, every curve and line perfect, as though time itself had chosen to preserve it. Marcus stepped closer, unable to look away. The air around it seemed charged, heavy with the echo of memory. Recognition dawned slowly, and when it came, it crushed him. This was not just any car, it was the very car in which Naomi and Claire had died, the car Samuel had crawled out of bloodied and broken, the car that had become the tomb of his happiness. Marcus felt his stomach twist, his heart hammering, as he laid his hand against the flawless paint. It was cold to the touch, and yet it seemed to pulse with the ghost of the past. How could it look like this? The last he had heard, the wreck had been beyond repair. And yet here it stood, resurrected, restored to a perfection greater than before. As if Samuel's relentless labor had erased every scar. The leather seats shone, the chrome glistened, the tires were new, every inch of it radiating the devotion of decades. It was more than a car now. It was an artifact, a monument, a shrine. Marcus's eyes blurred with tears as he turned back to the shelves and opened another box. More journals. He lifted one, his hands trembling, and began to read. The words carved themselves into his mind. Samuel writing late at night of his torment, his guilt that he had lived when they had not, his desperate need to restore the machine that had killed them, as if by repairing it he might undo the past. I hear them when I work, one entry read. Every bolt I tighten, every dent I smooth, I hear Naomi's laugh, I hear Claire's song. If I can make this car whole again, perhaps I can make myself whole. But the truth is I never will. This is not redemption. This is punishment. And another passage written in a shaky hand years later bared the rawness of his pain. It should have been me. I relive that day with every turn of the wrench. I resurrect this machine not because I love it, but because it is the only way I can keep them near. I cannot let the world see it. They would see beauty. I see death. so I keep it locked away, because it is mine, my grief, my shame, my memorial. Marcus lowered the journal, his tears spilling freely. He turned back to the car and understood what it represented. To others, it would be a treasure worth millions, a rare jewel of engineering, the pinnacle of design. But to Samuel, it had been a corpse he had tended to, the embodiment of his guilt, a mirror of the pain he refused to release. Standing there in the silence of the garage, Marcus felt the enormity of his uncle's secret pressed down upon him. The perfection of the car was not triumph, but tragedy, not wealth, but sorrow. His uncle had poured his life into this restoration, not to glorify the machine, but to punish himself, to live every day in the shadow of the accident he could never forgive. Marcus's heart ached with the realization. His uncle had lived and died inside this garage, his days consumed by an endless ritual that both destroyed and preserved him. And now, by placing the key into Marcus's hand, Samuel had passed the burden on. The truth of the car, the truth of the grief, was now his to carry. He stood motionless for a long time, his eyes fixed on the gleaming vehicle, his thoughts circling the enormity of what lay before him. The garage was silent, but it was not empty. It was filled with echoes, with memories, with the essence of a man who had tried to build his way back to a life that had been stolen. And as Marcus breathed in the heavy air, he knew he was no longer merely a witness. He had become the keeper of the legacy, the heir not of wealth or possessions, but of sorrow too deep for words. Marcus remained in the garage for what felt like hours, though time no longer seemed to move in the ordinary sense. The silence pressed against him, broken only by the sound of his own uneven breathing and the faint hum of electricity from the bulb above. His eyes never left the car, that flawless and gleaming monument to his uncle's torment. It seemed at once beautiful and unbearable, its polished body reflecting a perfection that mocked the ruin it had once carried. He moved closer, tracing his fingertips along the curve of the fender, and felt a chill pass through him, as though the cold surface still carried the memory of screams and shattered glass. He could almost imagine his uncle there in the dimness, stooped over the machine with oil-stained hands, whispering apologies to the ghosts he could never let go. Marcus lowered himself onto the stool by the workbench and opened one of the journals he had set aside earlier. His eyes scanned the cramped handwriting, every line heavy with sorrow, every sentence soaked in regret. In those words, he heard his uncle's voice, not the voice of the withdrawn man who had kept the world at bay for decades, but the voice of a grieving husband and father, desperate to make sense of a senseless loss. "I rebuild because I cannot forget," one entry read. "To let the wreck rust would be to admit that they are gone forever. But if I make the car whole again, if I restore it to the beauty it once held, perhaps I can pretend, for a little while, that they are near. Perhaps I can drive down the road and hear Claire singing in the back seat. Perhaps I can feel Naomi's hand in mine. Perhaps I can undo the moment when everything was stolen." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he turned the page. The next passage, written in a trembling scrawl, seemed almost unbearable to read. "I know the truth. They will never return. This car is not resurrection. It is my tomb. But I cannot let anyone else see it. They would call it a masterpiece, a jewel of engineering, a prize worth fortunes. They would not see the blood in its seams, the screams caught in its frame. To them it would be beauty. To me it is penance. So I keep it locked away. So I let the world think me mad. So I die with this secret, for it is mine alone to carry." The words blurred as Marcus's tears fell onto the paper. He closed the journal and pressed it to his chest, overwhelmed by the enormity of what his uncle had endured. This garage, which the family had mocked as a place of eccentricity, was in truth a sanctuary of grief. The car was not a treasure to be flaunted, but a monument to pain, each bolt and panel a prayer, each polished surface a confession. Samuel had rebuilt not to preserve the car, but to preserve his guilt, to live each day inside the shadow of the tragedy he could never escape. Marcus rose and walked toward the car again. His hand touched the door handle, and he hesitated, then slowly pulled it open. The hinges moved smoothly, the interior gleaming as though brand new. He lowered himself into the driver's seat, the leather soft beneath him, the scent of polish still lingering. For a moment the silence broke, not with sound, but with memory. He could almost hear Claire's laughter behind him, Naomi's gentle voice beside him, the faint echo of a song playing on the radio. The illusion was so strong that his eyes welled once more, and he pressed his hands to his face, allowing the sobs he had tried to contain to rack his body. When at last he raised his head, he looked at the gleaming dashboard and understood the enormity of the choice that lay before him. To sell the car would mean wealth beyond imagination. Collectors would fight for it, museums would covet it, and its value would transform the lives of every relative who had stood at the funeral whispering of Samuel's strangeness. But to sell it would also be to strip it of meaning, to turn his uncle's decades of torment into a mere transaction. Marcus knew then that he could not allow it. This was not an object to be bartered. It was a story, a legacy, a testament to love and loss that transcended value. His uncle had entrusted him not with riches, but with memory, and to betray that would be to betray Samuel himself. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to put the house in order. He cleaned the dust, organized the papers, and preserved the journals, each one cataloged and stored. The garage, however, remained as Samuel had left it. He invited no one inside, refusing to let curious relatives or eager neighbors set their eyes upon the car. Instead, he began to plan something different. He reached out to a local historian, someone who had once documented the lives of ordinary men whose stories carried extraordinary weight. He explained that he wanted not to sell, but to preserve. The historian listened, at first incredulous, then deeply moved, and together they began the work of designing a memorial. It would not be a public museum in the grand sense, not yet, but a private space dedicated to the truth. Visitors would not see the car as a trophy, but as a testament. They would read the journals, see the photographs of Naomi and Claire, and understand that behind every gleaming panel lay a man's heart shattered beyond repair. The car would stand not as a symbol of wealth, but as a shrine to love, to grief, and to the human inability to let go. On the first day, Marcus opened the doors to a small gathering. He stood beside the car and spoke. His voice trembled, but he found strength in the story he told. He spoke of his uncle's brilliance, of his family's warmth, of the tragedy that had destroyed them. He spoke of the decades Samuel spent alone, pouring his soul into a machine not to celebrate it, but to punish himself, to keep alive the memory of those he had lost. And as he spoke, tears flowed freely from those who listened, for they understood that what they were seeing was not luxury, but legacy, not perfection, but pain transformed into a monument. That night, when the doors were closed and the lights dimmed, Marcus lingered in the garage. He sat once more in the driver's seat, his hand resting on the steering wheel, polished smooth by his uncle's touch. The silence was deep, but no longer suffocating. For the first time, Marcus felt not just grief, but peace. Samuel had carried this burden alone for too long, but now the truth was shared, the memory preserved, the pain transformed into meaning. He whispered into the stillness, though no one was there to hear him. "I'll take care of it, Uncle. I'll make sure they remember. Not just the car, but you. Not the silence, but the love." As he rose to leave, he glanced back one final time. The car stood gleaming in the half-light, every curve perfect, every shadow alive with history. To others, it might one day be seen as the rarest of treasures, a fortune beyond measure. But to Marcus, it would always be more than that. It would be a promise fulfilled, a legacy honored, and a reminder that even in the deepest sorrow, love endures. And so he turned off the light, closed the garage door, and stepped into the night, his heart heavy yet lifted, his tears drying in the cool air. For the first time since the funeral, he no longer felt alone. His uncle's story had become his own, and with it came not just grief but strength, the strength to live not as a prisoner of the past, but as its guardian. The legacy of pain had become a legacy of love, and in that transformation lay the quiet redemption Samuel had sought but never found. It was Marcus who would carry it forward, not as a weight to crush him, but as a flame to light the memory of those who were gone, and the man who had never stopped loving them. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next powerful story. Watch more of our videos right now. Each one is full of secrets, twists, and unforgettable moments. And if you felt something today, share this video with your friends and family. Let them experience it too.